Today I want to share with you how to make homemade tomato soup, and I've got 5 tips for you so that your soup comes out perfectly delicious every time. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, ferment, sourdough, and more. So if you enjoy learning about those things, consider subscribing to my channel and don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. Well, making homemade tomato soup is very easy to do, and once you get the basics down, you're never going to buy canned tomato soup again. In its simplest form, homemade tomato soup is basically made up of 3 ingredients, and that's butter, onions, and tomatoes. And of course some water, if you count that as a 4th ingredient. But you can really improve the overall flavor of your homemade tomato soup by just adding a few extra ingredients. So today I want to show you how to make a homemade tomato soup, but I also want to share some tips with you to really bring your tomato soup to the best flavor you've ever had. As I mentioned, basic tomato soup has 3 ingredients: butter, onions, and tomatoes. And it's the butter that's really key, and that's tip number 1. Yes, you can use olive oil, but it's not going to give you that same smooth mouthfeel that using butter will give you when you make a homemade tomato soup. Now what I've got here is 4 tablespoons of butter, but you don't need to write anything down because if you open the description underneath this video, you'll see the word recipe. Click on that and it'll take you over to my website, Mary's Nest, same name as my YouTube channel, and you can read the recipe online or print it out. And tip number 2, you want to make sure you use plenty of onions. Yellow onions work great, and if you can find the sweet Vidalias or the sweet Texas onions, all the better. As your onions cook down in your soup, they're going to become sweeter and sweeter. And that sweetness is going to help offset some of the acidity in your tomatoes, which is what's going to give you that wonderful flavor along with the butter for a very smooth tasting tomato soup. And I recommend cutting up 2 large onions. I didn't have large, I had small, so I cut up 4 small onions. But you can never err on the side of onion, so the more the better. Now in the same category of onions, you want to add some garlic. I've got some garlic here in my mortar and pestle. I recommend that you use 4 cloves of garlic. Again, I didn't have 4 large cloves, which is what I recommend, 4 large cloves of garlic. I had some small ones, so I threw a couple of extra in there. But if you've got 4 nice large cloves of garlic, that'll be perfect. And just like the onions, as they cook along and simmer in your soup, they're going to become sweeter and tastier. And that's going to also add to the wonderful taste and mouthfeel along with the butter and the onions for making a lovely soup. Now I know when it comes to garlic, some of you always say more is better, and others of you say, oh, I don't like it, I can't digest it, so on and so forth. So if you have to leave it out, you certainly can. But I recommend that you try it once when you make tomato soup, and you're going to let this simmer a good long while, so it's not going to be a harsh garlic flavor at all. Because that can really be a problem when you make homemade tomato soup. A lot of people will only simmer it for a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes at the most. And you really want to let it simmer more like 45 minutes to even maybe an hour, so that all of the flavors cook down beautifully and meld together and become sweeter. Now in my mortar and pestle, I've also got some red pepper flakes. My husband always likes everything a little spicy. He's a good Texan, and so I've got about a half a teaspoon of red pepper flakes in there. You can certainly leave those out, and alternatively you could add a little black pepper. I'm not a fan of black pepper only because it has all the little black specks in your tomato soup, but I know that not everybody has white pepper on hand, so if you want to add some pepper, certainly go ahead and add in some black pepper. And you're really only going to need about a half a teaspoon of black pepper. Now I do like to add some salt to my tomato sauce, even though I'm going to use canned tomatoes, which we'll talk about in a minute. And I like to start with a half a teaspoon of salt. And I just use a fine ground sea salt, but use whatever you have. And then at the end, when you taste it, you can always add additional salt or additional seasonings. Alrighty, tip number 3. You want to add some sweetener to your soup. Yes, as the onions cook down and the garlic cooks down, that's going to add some sweetness, but adding a little extra sweetness is all the better. And I recommend 1 tablespoon of sugar. Now what I've got here is sucanat. This is just the whole dried sugarcane juice. It's got all the nutrients still intact, so I like to use this, but you can also use white sugar if you're still more at the beginning of your traditional foods journey from leaving a processed foods kitchen behind, and you still have white sugar. And you have not added these more whole sugars like sucanat or coconut sugar or maple sugar, whatever the case may be, you can go ahead and use white sugar. And you're just going to need about 1 tablespoon. Now I know for some of you, you've completely eliminated any types of sweetener from your diet, even if they're whole sweeteners, and I understand that completely. So what I recommend in place of that is to add some chopped carrot. And all you're going to need is about 1/2 carrot. Just dice it up. It's going to cook down and you're not even going to notice it in your soup, but it'll help to add a little bit of sweetness, again, to offset any acidity that comes with your tomatoes. Now, you're going to need some liquid to add to your tomato soup. And tip number 4, you want to use some type of broth or bone broth as the liquid base for your homemade tomato soup. And for your broth or bone broth, you're going to need 2 cups of your liquid base. And certainly you can add water, but if you want to improve the flavor and the nutrition, I highly recommend using some type of broth or bone broth. I've got some chicken bone broth here, and if you've been with me a while, you know I have a lot of videos on how to make bone broth, and I'll be sure to link to that in the iCards and in the description below. And if I ever run out of iCards in any of my videos, I always put everything in the description. Now, bone broth really adds a number of things. Not only does it add flavor and nutrition, it also adds to the mouthfeel of your soup, because bone broth is very high in gelatin, which is cooked collagen, and that has a very smooth mouthfeel. And also the nutrition that it brings, because it is very high in gelatin, is that it's wonderful for soothing our gut lining. And so if you've ever found in the past that tomato soup is a little acidic for you or a little irritating to your stomach, you may find using bone broth as your liquid base for your tomato soup is going to have the soup agree with you, and you're going to find it very enjoyable. And also the fact that bone broth is high in gelatin, that's wonderful for our skin, our hair, our nails. It's just really, to a certain extent, it's sort of a miracle liquid. And I like to use chicken bone broth because it has a relatively mild flavor, but certainly you could use beef bone broth if you want. The nice thing about making chicken bone broth, if you're new to making bone broth, is that you can make chicken bone broth literally for pennies. You're just going to use the carcass of a chicken and some vegetable scraps, and you'll have a wonderful bone broth. You can also just use broth if you want. If you just have a very light chicken bone broth, that's fine too. Not chicken bone broth, but chicken broth, which is just made a little differently. And I have a video where I explain the differences between broth and stock and bone broth and whatnot. But broth is a little lighter liquid than bone broth. You can certainly use that. If you want to keep this more vegetarian, you could certainly use a vegetable broth. And I have videos where I show you how to make a very super mineral rich vegetable broth, and that would be wonderful here. And yes, you can certainly use water, but I highly recommend trying some type of broth here. So that's tip number 4. Use some type of broth or bone broth for making a wonderful homemade tomato soup. And now tip number 5. Let's talk about the tomatoes. When it comes to making homemade tomato soup, you can use fresh tomatoes or you can use canned tomatoes. If you want to use fresh tomatoes, you're going to want to look for the Italian plum tomatoes. A common variety you may see at your grocery store, or maybe you've grown in your garden over the summer, are the Roma tomatoes. The nice thing about using Italian plum tomatoes is that the skins are very thin, so you will not have to peel the tomatoes first. They also generally don't have a lot of seeds, so you can just go ahead and cut them up and throw them right into your pan. And then as your tomato soup simmers, those skins are going to become very soft. And if you like a pureed tomato soup and you go ahead and puree it, those skins are basically going to dissolve into nothing. And the seeds also may disintegrate. But if you do see some seeds in the tomato soup, you can easily pour it through a mesh strainer into a bowl, and then you'll have a perfect pureed tomato soup. Now, if you like a more chunky tomato soup and you don't want to completely puree it, then I recommend using canned tomatoes. Now, you can certainly make a chunky tomato soup with fresh tomatoes, but if you are going to leave it chunky, then you're probably going to want to just dip your tomatoes in hot water first and peel the skins off. But using canned tomatoes gives you the option of having a chunky homemade tomato soup or a very smooth tomato soup, and making it very easy. Now, this is sort of a little bonus tip within tip number 5 in terms of using Italian plum tomatoes. If you can find the Italian San Marzanos in the can, or maybe you are lucky enough to be able to grow these wherever you may live, I highly recommend using the San Marzanos to make homemade tomato soup. But don't worry if you can't find San Marzano tomatoes. Just make sure that you're picking some variety of canned Italian plum tomatoes. They really are going to make the best tomato soup as opposed to other varieties of canned tomatoes. And the good news is Italian plum tomatoes in the can that have already been peeled for you are generally pretty easy to find at the grocery store. Alrighty, well now let's get to making our tomato soup. And the first thing I'm going to do is just turn my little cooktop here up to medium, and I'm going to go ahead and drop my butter down into my soup pot. Now while my butter is melting in my soup pot, I'm going to go ahead and mash my garlic along with the salt and the red pepper flakes. I really like to mash my garlic to the point where it's sort of like a paste, but you can certainly just chop this up with your knife. When my son was a little boy and he would be helping me cook in the kitchen, this was always his favorite job. Now I want to mention this particular recipe serves 8, but if you want to cut this in half, you certainly can. It'll work just fine. Or you can even double it if you're serving a crowd. And I also wanted to mention that towards the end of this video, I'll also tell you the different ways you can turn this into a cream of tomato soup, as well as a tomato basil soup that's become very popular in the French restaurants. Well, my butter's all melted, and I'm going to go ahead and add in my onions. Oh, lovely sizzle. I like that. Now I'm just going to stir these around in the butter, and I'm going to watch them and just let them become a little translucent. And don't worry when you're chopping up your onion, really no particular size is of great concern, because we will be pureeing this somewhat, either into a fine puree, or if we're even leaving it a little chunky, the onions are going to be very soft and cooked. So as long as, don't worry about a mince or a dice or any of that, just the chopped onion in any way that you're able to chop it up is just fine. Well, my onions are beautifully softened. That takes about 2 to 3 minutes. Now I'm going to go ahead and add in my mashed garlic that I mashed along with the red pepper flakes and the salt. The salt really helps make quick work of the job. Then all I'm going to do is mix this real well to get the garlic well distributed amongst the onions, and really just cook this for about a minute or so. You'll start to smell the wonderful fragrance of the garlic cooking, and you'll know you're ready to move on to the next step. Now I'm just going to go ahead and sprinkle in my little bit of sucanat. You can add your sugar, or if you're adding in some chopped carrot, you can go ahead and add that at this point as well. Now the star of the show are tomatoes, and what I've got, I'm using canned tomatoes, as I mentioned earlier, and I've got 2 of the large cans of Italian plum, and these are, as I said, the San Marzano, and this size can is a 28-ounce can. Now I'm going to go ahead and add in my second can of the tomatoes. So we'll get those all in there, and next what I'm going to do is just stir this all up so that the onions, the garlic, everything along with the tomatoes are well mixed. Now at this point, what I like to do is take a potato masher and just start to break up the tomatoes a little bit. This is not required. They're going to cook, they're going to soften, and then you're going to puree it in one way or another, either to a chunky stage or a smooth stage. But I do feel this helps facilitate the cooking a little bit. So if you don't have a potato masher, like a wooden spoon or something like that, you can mash them along the side of the pot just to break it up a little, just to break them up a little. Now at this point, I'm going to go ahead and add in my bone broth. Well, once I get all that bone broth poured in there, then I just give it another stir to distribute that evenly amongst our lovely tomato mixture here. Now, the next thing that I like to do is just bring this up to like a medium to a medium-high simmer. I don't like to bring it up to a boil because we do have garlic in there and we never want to risk having any garlic burn. Burnt garlic is very bitter and it'll ruin your soup. So be very careful about that. But I'm just going to bring it up to like a medium simmer. And once that comes up to a medium simmer, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to put my lid on. I'm going to turn this down to the lowest setting that I have on my little cooktop here. And I'm going to let that simmer covered for about 45 minutes. Well, I let this simmer on low for 45 minutes and it has just cooked beautifully. The tomatoes are all broken up and the onions are barely visible, very translucent. Now, if you wanted, you could go ahead and just serve this as is, kind of as a chunky tomato/onion type soup. However, what I like to do is to take one of these hand blenders, and I always laugh when I use this. I remember watching the chef Emeril Lagasse on TV, and he used to call it a boat motor. That always made me laugh. But I'm going to puree this. Now, you can puree it just a little bit to leave still some chunkiness to it, but where the onions have basically been pureed to the point where they've disappeared. The other option is to really puree it where it's a really beautiful, smooth tomato soup. Now, if you don't have one of these, don't worry. You can do this in a blender. You probably just want to do it in batches and make sure that you have the top tilted a little so the steam can escape. Well, I've got the heat off and I'm going to go ahead and start blending this. Now, when you've got it to this stage where it's beautifully pureed, you have a couple of options. You can go ahead and just serve this as is, or you can turn it into a cream of tomato soup. And if you want to do that, you're going to want to add half a cup of heavy cream. Sometimes it's called heavy whipping cream. But I know some of you have told me that you've not been able to find heavy whipping cream at your grocery store. Don't worry, you can use something called light cream or table cream, and you're just going to want to add 3/4 of a cup. Now, instead of making this a cream of tomato soup, if you want to make this a tomato basil soup, what you're going to do instead is leave out the cream, just start with it as is in this state, and you're going to want to add in about 1/4 to 1/2 cup of chopped fresh basil. Now, you can certainly also use dried basil to get a similar flavor. It'll just look slightly different. And if you do decide to go with dried basil, just start with about a tablespoon and give it a taste and see how that is. And with the basil, you can also add in some grated Parmigiano Reggiano cheese or like a Grana Padano. It's very similar to the Parmigiano Reggiano, but it's less expensive, which is nice. And you can put in about 1/4 to 1/2 cup grated into your soup, or you can simply leave it on the side and sprinkle it on top of your soup, and also leave a little fresh basil in reserve and sprinkle on the fresh basil as well. That makes a lovely presentation. Well, this looks delicious. I think it would be wonderful with some saltines, maybe homemade saltines or a grilled cheese sandwich. I think it'd just be perfect. Well, let's give this a taste. Oh, that's so delicious. It's so smooth, you're going to really enjoy this. Now, if you'd like more recipes using tomatoes, including a marinara sauce, how to dry tomatoes to make candied tomatoes that are just luscious, be sure to click on this video over here, where I have a full tomato playlist, also including how to make tomato powder and how to ferment tomatoes. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country Kitchen. Love and God bless.